Hello and welcome to our lecture on the Commerce Power, and we're going to be talking about early New Deal losses and the Supreme Court attempting to continue to interpret the Commerce Clause in light of direct and indirect effects doctrine and stream of commerce doctrine while the American economy was undergoing radical change. So just to give you some background here, the direct and indirect effects doctrine and the stream of commerce doctrine that we've already discussed were very popular and actually worked quite well during the major economic booms of the 1920s. Monopolies were huge. There were huge profits, lots of people getting rich. Stocks were very high, and people were making a lot of money off of speculating on the performance of companies. And we had three presidents who were basically laissez-faire. Laissez-faire, of course, means that government is hands-off and that the market is capable of regulating itself, and that the federal government should stay out of regulating economic transactions in most circumstances and only get involved when there was some sense of public abuse that occurred directly to the market itself. That's nice, except when you define labor as being outside the market, then the federal government isn't able to create national standards to prevent abuse of children through their employment too early in life, and also can't keep some companies from exploiting that kind of labor to the detriment of others. We elected three laissez-faire presidents: Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. All of whom sided with the court. The court was also laissez-faire and argued that the federal government should not regulate manufacturing and labor and could only regulate a thing once it had entered interstate commerce. Unfortunately, though, in 1929 we experienced a huge economic downturn. The value of stocks in the United States dropped by an average of 75%. Unemployment was up to 25% and much higher in some states. In many states, every third person you meet was unemployed. I work at Arkansas State University. A student came to me and said that things have gone really well for him because his great-grandfather starved to death in Arkansas during the Great Depression. His grandfather was able to put one meal a week on the table, and his father was able to put 3 meals a day on the table for his family. He feels like that was tremendous progress, and he actually had a very different take on the New Deal. He had a great deal of respect for FDR and the programs that attempted to regulate and right the economy. You should note, though, that during this time, socialists, I'm not certain I would say communists were powerful in the United States, but certainly the Socialist Party was very powerful, particularly in the Midwest. It was a third-party alternative. At one point, the socialist candidate received 19% of the vote in the United States. That's a particularly powerful minor party. So the message was clear at this point that laissez-faire economics did not work, and the government needed to be empowered to regulate things that, like manufacturing and things that were wholly local in concern, to keep the economy from going off the tracks. As a result of this, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president in 1932, and he switches to a very clearly regulatory and bureaucratic scheme, a state that regulated the economy pervasively. I would like to note, though, that this kind of regulation, we overlook one important aspect of it, and that was that while businesses accepted this kind of pervasive state regulation, Roosevelt made certain that the people who were doing the regulating were people from the industries that were being regulated. In effect, the industries were regulating themselves through government. We actually have seen this continue into the present day. President Obama, during his first term, promised radical change in the way that the markets were regulated, and then appointed the same old people to regulate our market, including Secretary of the Treasury, who came there directly from Goldman Sachs. So the first 100 days of the FDR administration were radical in terms of the number of laws passed, the regulations, pervasive regulations of industries, and the court did not take a very favorable view of these policies. In particular, you might remember the Panama Refining Company case v. Ryan. Panama Refining Company v. Ryan was a case in which the Supreme Court said, no, 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 Congress, you may not give President Roosevelt the authority to legislate without providing him guidelines and principles for doing so. So they struck down the effort of Congress just to hand over a good deal of its legislating power to Roosevelt. The last straws here, there are a series of cases that occur involving stream of commerce doctrine. Schechter Poultry, also known as the sick chicken case, dealt with where commerce ends. In other words, a thing can enter the stream of commerce, but then there is an end point to that stream of commerce too, a beginning and an end. Carter versus Carter Cole deals with when commerce begins. When can the federal government regulate commerce at the beginning of a interstate commercial transaction? And these two decisions striking down New Deal legislation and saying that the federal government was attempting to regulate things that were wholly local in character, this brought about so much frustration in FDR that he devised a court packing plan. He was going to nominate a new justice for each justice over the age of 70. The public, who had just elected FDR, was outraged by this. They did not support it, but it got the court's attention, and it resulted in a change. But first, let's look at these two cases. So Schechter Poultry involved the regulation of the poultry industry and the butchering practices of butchers at the end point sale. So a chicken would enter the stream of commerce when it was shipped to a distribution plant, and then it was shipped to a local butcher, and then the butcher would butcher that chicken and sell it to an endpoint consumer. The federal government attempted to regulate the butchering of that chicken, the process of butchering that chicken. Well, Schechter Poultry didn't abide by the regulations, and they were fined by the federal government, and he sued. He said, by the time that I'm butchering this chicken, it has dropped out of the stream of commerce. I do all my business within the state of New York. And so the question there was, may Congress delegate to the president the power to draft and enforce codes that regulate industries? And may he do so, and may he regulate industries even where a thing has dropped out of the stream of commerce? The court says no to both of those questions by a 9-0 vote. Court says these regulations are not within the Commerce Clause power granted to Congress. Neither the slaughter nor the sale of poultry in the state of New York after a chicken has moved across state boundaries involved interstate commerce. Congress can't give the president the power, and the president can't regulate this endpoint transaction. Carter versus Carter Cole occurred on the other side of the stream of commerce at the beginning. This is another example of a collusive case. The question here was, may Congress pass legislation that imposes standards on the coal industry and then levy a tax on the coal industry to pay for the program? Now, coal is, the extraction of coal is not transaction, it is manufacturing. And the court, once again, reaffirmed this and said, no, there may be evils associated with the price of coal fluctuating so dramatically that some people freeze to death and can't afford coal, while others can buy it as if it's candy. All of the evils on which the law focused are local evils. The extraction of coal, right? The process by which coal is extracted, that's a local evil. And thus the federal government has no control over them. In short, the federal government does not, the federal power does not attach until interstate commercial intercourse begins. This decision, although it's a stream of commerce decision, it's very much like the earlier decisions, Hammer v. Dagenhart, and others that we've discussed. For the rest of this lecture, I've just given you some editorial cartoons that showed people's concern about FDR packing the court. Here's an example. FDR is interviewing people to see if they would be good for a Supreme Court job. And he says, great, now once more all together. And they all say, yes, we're going to reaffirm your policies. And if you look down there in the waste bin, the scales of justice and the Constitution are in there. Here we have a very famous one, a baseball analogy. He ain't just fast enough, meaning that the court isn't changing fast enough with the times. And so the old 9 have been benched. And then here we have one very much in favor of FDR. Lincoln may have emancipated the slaves, but FDR is going to emancipate the worker by taking off the shackles of a reactionary Supreme Court and acting in support of public welfare. Okay, thank you very much for your attention, and we'll move along.